What should every staff member know about data protection?
I think everyone has to be aware of the inherent risks when dealing with sharing of personal data, in particular with third parties. And with cash assistance, that is what is happening. We have to share data with third parties. And what you also need to bear in mind always are the protection principles in terms of data protection. And they include, at least in UNHCR, legitimate and fair processing, the purpose specification. It's very important. Why are you sharing the data? You really need to reflect. Is it for the purpose of assistance? Is it for analyzing? Is it really worth then to just share personal data if it is, for example, a purpose of an analysis? In UNHCR, we don't think it is. The necessity and proportionality is a very important protection principle, and the accuracy and respect for the rights of the data subject, and confidentiality. I can't highlight this, how important this one is. Security and accountability and supervision. Of course, the data privacy impact assessment are key when you're working with third parties.
Data protection, it's not specific to cash. Regardless of the modality of assistance, I think that every organization should be looking carefully at data protection issues. I believe that in the cash arena, data protection gained momentum because of the importance that we are putting on individual data, whereas before a lot of organizations were doing service delivery type of assistance where individual data were maybe less collected. And now with the amount of individual data that we are collecting, with the amount of stakeholders that are involved in collecting and transferring these data to private sector provider or other humanitarian organization, it is extremely important to make sure that we get a minimum understanding of what data protection is. I think that the most important thing that we should all know is informed consent. And the first word is really very important. The consent can freely be given only when it's truly informed. And this is definitely a challenge for a humanitarian practitioner to make sure that they manage to explain what the data are being used for. Other important concepts are linked to purpose. We should always, and proportionality. We should always make sure that we collect data that are proportional to the need that we want to use those data, and specifically for a purpose. Even when we want to share data with other organizations for assistance, we always need to make sense that we understand why are we sharing them. And we put that into writing because it needs to be explicit that it is for this purpose that these data are shared. And this protects the organization, and it protects the accountability that the organization has towards beneficiary. Same goes for the legal basis for which we are sharing the data, whether it's consent, public interest, to protect the life of the data subject. Before considering to give out this data, we should always ask ourselves, what legal basis do we have to give them out, and why are we doing so, for which purpose? And then, of course, lastly but not least, I think that the issue of security, it's supremely important. It's a bit distinct from data protection, but the fact that we use system that store in a secure and allow the organization to handle in a secure way the data of beneficiary is fundamental, because otherwise we really could not enforce a lot of the data protection principle that I've just mentioned.
So data protection is a super interesting topic, because as a technology service provider, we work very hard to make sure that data is secured at every point. So whether that's data collection, data communication, data storage, and data use. I think it's important for people to understand that the protection of data doesn't stop there. There are, I think, a lot of great tools that help with the data planning phase. So what participation from the community, understanding what data is being collected, understanding how it's collected, collecting only what you need. But there's also, when those practices are in place and programs are in the form of operation, data is shared quite often. People love to download their spreadsheets. People love to look at and analyze it in different places, what works for them. And so I think as a service provider, we want to be able to support data protection in any point that you're using the data. For example, we've got the ability to anonymize data when you download it. So if you want statistics, you don't need the PII along with it. But I think that also I'd love to do more capacity building to help staff understand when you're using it, what that means. As part of different, for example, NetHope technology groups, we talk a lot about, okay, but what does it mean when it's stored locally on your computer as well, when you go into the field? You know, and that's not something that we as a platform service provider can really own, but we can certainly help with capacity building and helping people look at different ways of thinking about it, and then maybe even make adjustments ourselves, like the download only what you need to be able to protect that.
La protection des données, c'est vraiment la responsabilité de tous. Donc connaître les principes est la base et comprendre ensuite comment cela concerne son rôle tout au long du cycle du projet. Pour les programmes d'assistance monétaire où les données sont fréquemment partagées avec d'autres acteurs, notamment les partenaires de services financiers, les deux éléments suivants sont critiques. Premièrement, la proportionnalité et la minimisation, c'est-à-dire ne collecter que les données qui sont strictement nécessaires pour l'assistance pourvue, en analysant les risques qui peuvent être associés au partage des données selon les régulations Know Your Customer. Deuxièmement, c'est appliquer le principe de stricte limitation de l'objet du traitement des données, c'est-à-dire que les données collectées ne soient utilisées que pour leur but initial. Donc c'est très important de s'assurer que ce principe soit aussi reflété dans les contrats avec les partenaires de services financiers. Et en tant que bailleur de fonds, nous soutenons activement les approches collaboratives basées sur un partage responsable des données. Donc c'est important que les organisations qui collaborent aient un accord sur le partage des données et que le personnel concerné en connaisse les points principaux.
Every staff member must understand what is right to privacy, what are the principles of data protection. If just put yourself in the shoes of beneficiaries and think if you are concerned about your own privacy, how beneficiaries will be concerned about their privacies. Regarding the data protection, I will believe that we should consider. I believe that we should consider those principles on how privacy is respected, how the data is actually protected, what is security around it, how it flows, and what are the risks at each level, from the organization, from the holder of the data or processor of the data, or to the, you know, even if it goes to the financial service providers, or from financial service providers goes to the agents, and from there to community. I think we have to understand all those flows. These staff members also should understand all those flows. Data quality and accuracy, why it is important to get consent from the beneficiaries to use their data. Share with them how it will be used, where it will be used, with whom it will be, you know, shared, and other information, because it's very much important. And as per the GDPR, the consent is not only one time, it may be taken multiple times if there are any differences what you have actually discussed with your beneficiaries and what you have shared with beneficiaries in first place.
Well, the really easy answer, if your organization has any links to or is established in Europe, you need to know what GDPR stands for, General Data Protection Regulation, and how it might impact your work. And you should probably also know what a DPO stands for, your Data Protection Officer, who it is, and who it is. It's usually a contact at the head office, and it's a very important role that carries a huge burden of legal but also ethical liability for data protection, potential things going wrong. But in a well-established system, a good organization would also have a DPO focal points in countries and regions of operation. So actually do your research, find out who that is, and you want to be friends with them. Something that really stuck with me in conversations where it is hard to visualize why data protection might, and conceptualize why data protection is important. But if we start thinking about data about a person as an extension of that person, then you wouldn't want to cause harm to a person. So the same way you wouldn't want to harm their data. So it kind of changes the conversation a bit. So I would encourage CVA practitioners to start thinking about data protection, not as this dry subject, but it's essentially about protecting people we work with from real harm, and therefore protecting their data from real harm. So data is an extension of an individual. And then another thing we don't think about often enough in my experience is that it is always about trade-offs. So you can go very far down the line of protecting, but data can also be very useful if shared. So it's always a careful balancing act. So how can you have this protection mindset, but also the sharing mindset? So one common misconception about data and data protection is that it is only digital forms of data that need to be protected, but very often actually data incidents happen when it is when data is on paper, when data is on equipment that gets passed around, or it's on unencrypted equipment. So that's something to bear in mind. You know, when you think about data protection, you need to think about the weakest link. Where is your weakest link? And very often, anybody who works on information security would tell you is the weakest link is the user. So, you know, things that we get reminded about regularly by IT, you know, have strong passwords in place, change them, don't share them, don't leave your equipment lying around. These are all very important tips in, you know, as a CVA practitioner, you need to bear in mind.
Staff must know the importance of data protection in the workplace. New staff must be acquainted with the data protection policies and protocols as soon as possible. The managers should consider setting up a brief data protection training. Without data protection, inaccuracies in the data can start to create problems. Since the humanitarian organization work with the state and non-state actors, therefore humanitarian organizations should ensure advocacy with all state and non-state actors about data protection.
Consider data protection as you would approach security in a humanitarian context. Adapt your security mitigation measures to the level of the threat, plan, and dedicate resources for it. Now about beneficiary privacy. Think about beneficiary privacy like it was yours. Would you like some stranger to ask you a lot of questions about you and your family, including your address, your demographics, your bank account numbers, and displayed publicly and on the internet? I don't, and beneficiaries neither.